Welcome to episode 6 of Rise of a Nation. This episode is on El Salvador.
Welcome to our deep dive into the history of El Salvador.
Right.
We're going to be going on kind of a chronological journey here. We're going to be exploring some of the key moments that have shaped this fascinating nation, from Spanish colonization all the way to the tumultuous Salvadoran Civil War.
I think what's really crucial to understand here is how each period really is intricately woven into the next.
Right.
So we're going to be uncovering events from centuries past that really still resonate in El Salvador today.
I'm ready to kind of unravel this historical tapestry, so to speak.
Right.
Let's start with the Spanish arrival in the 16th century. I know before the conquistadors, the land that we now know as El Salvador was home to pretty vibrant indigenous kingdoms. One that comes to mind is the Kingdom of Cuscatlan.
Yeah, and these kingdoms had their own very rich cultures, very complex social structures.
Yeah.
But the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century really just irrevocably altered the course of El Salvador's history.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about figures like Pedro de Alvarado, who really led the charge in this conquest.
I imagine the impact on the indigenous populations was pretty profound.
Absolutely. I mean, we're not just talking about a change in rulers.
Right.
This was a complete societal transformation. Traditional ways of life were disrupted, new agricultural practices were introduced, and really the very fabric of their world was completely reshaped.
One of the most enduring legacies of this period is the introduction of coffee, right?
Hmm.
It became such a cornerstone of El Salvador's economy, but also it seems to have played a role in deepening social inequalities as well.
Yeah, that's a key insight there.
Yeah.
The way that land was distributed and the system of labor that was established around coffee cultivation really created this sort of concentration of wealth in the hands of just a few elite families. And this really laid the groundwork for the socioeconomic disparities that would continue to plague El Salvador for really centuries to come.
Yeah, so even as we move into the era of independence, those seeds of inequality planted during colonization are still very much present.
Precisely. El Salvador, they declare independence from Spain in 1821. They join this wave of liberation movements that's sweeping across Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
But as we'll see, independence, doesn't automatically translate into equality or widespread prosperity.
Right. It's interesting to think about how these newly independent nations were figuring out their place in the world.
Yeah.
El Salvador even had a brief stint as part of the Mexican Empire, right?
Yes, so in 1822, El Salvador was incorporated into the Mexican Empire under Agustín de Iturbide,
Okay.
a very short-lived union lasting only about a year.
What led to its dissolution? Was there resistance from within El Salvador, or was it more about the internal dynamics of the Mexican Empire itself?
It was really a combination of factors. There were internal divisions within the Mexican Empire itself, and there was also resistance from some segments of Salvadoran society. They saw this union as a threat to their newfound autonomy. So by 1823, El Salvador had broken away from the Mexican Empire.
So it seems like a period of uncertainty and transition. Were there any other attempts at regional integration during this time?
There was. So El Salvador then joined the Federal Republic of Central America in 1823. And this was an attempt to create a unified Central American state, much like the United States.
Oh, that's fascinating. It makes you wonder what Central America might look like today if that union had endured.
It's a really thought-provoking question. Unfortunately, the Federal Republic was plagued by internal conflicts and political instability, and by 1841 it had dissolved. And so El Salvador, along with the other Central American states, became fully independent republics once again.
So we see this kind of recurring theme here of short-lived unions.
Yeah.
And the challenges of forging this lasting regional unity. Perhaps these struggles over identity and autonomy also played a role in the border disputes that El Salvador experienced with its neighbors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to make that connection. The dissolution of these larger entities really left behind a legacy of contested boundaries and territorial claims. So let's start by looking at the border with Guatemala.
From what I've gathered, this particular border dispute has deep historical roots, going all the way back to the colonial era.
Yes. So the boundaries established during Spanish rule were often, vague. They were poorly defined. And this created a kind of a breeding ground for future conflicts as El Salvador and Guatemala sought to assert their their sovereignty over these disputed territories.
One specific point of contention I came across was Cerro Monte Cristo. It sounds like this mountain peak became a symbol of this broader struggle over the border.
Yeah, it did. Cerro Monte Cristo, rising high above the surrounding landscape, really became this focal point for this historical tug of war. And it took decades of negotiations and even the involvement of Honduras, which shared a border with both El Salvador and Guatemala, to finally reach a resolution.
And what was that resolution? Did they divide the mountain or something?
They did something even more symbolic, I think.
Yeah.
In 1936, the three nations agreed that Cerro Monte Cristo would be the tripoint where their borders met. So it became this physical manifestation of their shared history and the complexities of defining these national boundaries.
Oh, wow. So the mountain that once divided them became a point of unity in a way. But I imagine that even with the tripoint established, defining the rest of the border presented its own set of challenges.
Absolutely. Rivers, for example, can shift over time, and that makes it really difficult to establish a fixed boundary. The Rio Paz, which forms part of the El Salvador-Guatemala border, was one such case.
So how did they address that? Did they constantly have to redraw the border as the river changed its course?
Well, that would have been incredibly impractical. Instead, they came up with a really ingenious solution, I think. The 1938 delimitation treaty between El Salvador and Guatemala included this key clause. Even if the river moved, the boundary, as it was demarcated at that time, would remain fixed.
Oh, that's a really clever way to solve that problem.
Yeah.
It emphasizes that they were really focused on creating a lasting peace, not just a temporary fix. Did they do anything else to solidify the border?
Yeah, they marked the boundary with a series of monuments and pillars to physically demarcate the line on the ground. And these markers served as tangible reminders of the agreement that was reached and really helped prevent future disputes.
You would think that with such a clearly defined border that tensions would kind of subside, but from what I've read, that wasn't always the case.
You're right. Even with, precise mapping and these physical markers, historical echoes can linger.
Right.
And disagreements about the interpretation of the border, access to resources, even the movement of people across the border, these all continued to cause kind of friction between El Salvador and Guatemala.
It's a reminder that borders are more than just lines on a map, right?
Yeah.
They represent complex human stories, historical legacies, ongoing power dynamics.
Yeah.
Speaking of complex dynamics, the border with Honduras seems to have been shaped by a particularly unusual conflict, the football war.
Yes, the football war. It's a conflict that often raises eyebrows because of its name.
Yeah.
But as you'll see, the football war was about much more than just a sporting event.
I'm definitely intrigued. What were the underlying tensions that kind of fueled this conflict? I mean, was it really about football, or were there deeper issues at play?
At its core, the football war was driven by land reform issues and migration patterns.
Okay.
Honduras had a much larger land area relative to its population, while El Salvador, they faced land scarcity and rural poverty. This led to the migration of many Salvadorans into Honduras seeking land and opportunities.
I can see how that would create tension.
Yeah.
Was there resentment from the Honduran side towards these Salvadoran migrants?
Yeah, there was. The Honduran government began to see this influx of Salvadorans as a threat to their own economic and social stability.
Mm-hmm.
They enacted land reform policies that really disadvantaged Salvadoran migrants, expropriating land and pushing them back across the border. And this, of course, created resentment on the Salvadoran side, and the situation just grew increasingly volatile.
And then this simmering tension boils over during a World Cup qualifying match between the two countries in 1970. It's almost hard to believe that a sporting event could be the catalyst for an actual war.
Yeah, the match itself wasn't the sole cause of the war, of course.
Right.
But it became this focal point for the existing animosity between the two nations. And the media in both countries really played a role in escalating the tensions, portraying the other side as the aggressor, whipping up nationalistic fervor.
So football kind of became this symbol of this broader political and social conflict that was already brewing.
Exactly.
It was kind of a spark that ignited an already combustible situation.
Exactly. The actual fighting was brief, but it was intense. It lasted only 4 days. but it had a profound impact both in terms of human lives lost and the reconfiguration of the border.
Were there any significant territorial changes as a result of the war?
Yeah, there were. There were some border adjustments made as part of the peace settlement.
Okay.
And this further highlights how, conflict can reshape not only political relations, but also the physical landscape. The legacy of the football war is still felt today, serving as a reminder of the deep-seated tensions that can exist between neighboring nations, especially when, issues of land, resources, and migration are at play.
After the complexities of the borders with Guatemala and Honduras, I'm almost afraid to ask about the border with Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Was that another source of conflict for El Salvador?
It certainly had its share of challenges. The Gulf of Fonseca, which is shared by El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, has long been a source of contention.
Oh, of course. Another shared body of water, another set of potential conflicts. Was it about fishing rights, shipping lanes, or something else entirely?
All of those factors played a role, but one particular point of contention was the ownership of this tiny island called Mangura. Both El Salvador and Honduras laid claim to this island. And this further complicated the already tangled web of maritime boundaries in the Gulf of Fonseca.
It seems like islands have a way of becoming focal points for these kinds of disputes. Was this another case of history kind of repeating itself?
In a way, yes. The dispute over Mangura really echoed this broader historical pattern that we've seen of vaguely defined boundaries and competing claims to territory. In this case, the International Court of Justice eventually stepped in to resolve the issue.
So the court acted as a kind of referee in this island tug of war. Which country did they side with?
In 1992, the court awarded Mangura to Honduras, and this decision, while based on legal arguments and historical precedents, it didn't entirely erase the underlying tensions.
No, even with a legal ruling, those historical echoes can persist.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if there are still lingering disagreements about the Gulf of Fonseca, even today.
You raise a valid point. The complexity of shared maritime resources and navigation rights can keep these issues alive long after legal rulings are made. And it requires ongoing diplomacy and a willingness to cooperate to really ensure that these shared spaces don't become sources of future conflict.
It's fascinating how geography and history and politics all kind of intertwine to create these intricate border landscapes. Speaking of complex landscapes, our journey through El Salvador's history now leads us to a pivotal and tragic chapter, the Salvadoran Civil War.
Yes, this was a period of immense suffering and upheaval for El Salvador, a conflict that really left deep scars on the nation's psyche and continues to shape its present-day reality.
From what I understand, this wasn't just a sudden eruption of violence. There were deep-seated socioeconomic and political factors that paved the way for this devastating conflict.
You're absolutely right. To understand the Salvadoran Civil War, we really need to delve into the context that led up to it, a context that's rooted in those very same inequalities that we discussed earlier.
So the legacy of colonization, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the struggles for land and resources, they all kind of converge in this moment. It's almost as if history itself is setting the stage for this tragedy.
It's a powerful way to frame it. And to fully grasp the complexities of this conflict, we need to examine the specific factors that pushed El Salvador to the brink.
Okay.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
The next part will come out soon.